I'm Joshua Bardwell, and I've been testing LiPo batteries for drone racing and FPV acro freestyle flying. I've done 4 batches of testing now, and I'm about to give you an overview of the results from the 4th batch of testing. This video is actually a little bit delayed. I did the live stream where I tested the batteries before Christmas even, and I don't know why some of you like to watch 2 hours of me testing batteries, but some of you do, so more power to you. But for those of you who don't want to watch 2 hours of it, here's the overview video. And I apologize, this is a little bit delayed. I had some personal stuff that kept me from getting it out as fast as I want, but finally, here it is. Before I get into the results, I want to take 1 minute and apologize. I owe you viewers, and especially Newbie Drone, who sent me some batteries, an apology. Newbie Drone sent me some batteries, and I don't know, I put them in a different pile by accident. And so when I did the live stream testing, I completely overlooked them. So a big apology to Newbie Drone, and as kind of a way of making it up to them. Well, number 1, I tested the batteries, and I'm going to include them in this wrap-up. But number 2, I'm giving him a very short direct plug here, just as my way of saying, oops, I'm sorry, you sent me the battery and I just ignored it, pretended it didn't exist. My bad. One of the tests that I do is I discharge the battery to 14 volts at a 20 amp discharge rate. And the idea is that this is just a sort of a warm-up lap that lets me know if the battery is even worth testing at higher discharge rates. And in this video, I'm not even going to talk about the 20 amp discharge rate. The more of these videos I've done, the more I've come to feel that the higher discharge rate really tells the tale and tells you all you need to know about a battery's performance. The one thing that the 20 amp discharge rate will tell you that the 60 amp won't is if the battery is going to give you better capacity if you're actually pulling a lower discharge rate. So if you were speccing a battery for something like a fixed wing that is going to be pulling a reasonably constant 15 or 20 amps perhaps, then the 20 amp discharge rate would be more your speed. But for mini quads, for drone racing, FPV, whatever, you're often pulling much more than 20 amps, and it's very sort of peaky. You're having lots of punches and chops and punches and chops. You're seldom at a single throttle position very often. So I don't feel the 20 amp discharge rate is very reflective of real-world flight experiences. I think the 60 amp, it's not perfect, but it's closer. So you can look at this spreadsheet. The link is down in the video description if you want to dig through the data about the 20 amp discharge rate. But I'm going to move on and talk about the 60 amp discharge rate. So the next thing I do then is I discharge the battery to 14 volts at 60 amps. Why do I stop at 14 volts? So some people discharge their batteries to 13.5 volts under load, and then when they come down, it recovers to maybe 14.4 or 14.5, and then they put it on the charger and get it back to storage voltage, and they feel like that's fine. Well, the simple answer is I had to pick something, and 14 volts is what I use when I fly. When I fly, when the battery sags to 14 volts, if I then land and let the battery rest, it usually recovers to around 3.8 volts per cell, more or less. That's close to 15 volts resting. And that's, I think, a good place to be for if you're trying to balance performance with longevity. I've got a bunch of data in this spreadsheet. And what I'd like to do for you is I'd like to focus you in on the data that I think is the most indicative of the battery's overall performance. And the first of those is the longest burst column. The longest burst column is when I do the 60 amp testing, I hit the battery with a 60 amp discharge and it sags. And when it sags to 14 volts, I stop the discharge, I let it rest and recover, and then I hit it again. And I keep doing that until it's resting at 15 volts, and we call that a full discharge. The longest burst is the longest single discharge burst out of all of those. So typically that's the first or second one, and then they get shorter and shorter after that. A battery that delivers a longest burst is able to deliver current with less voltage sag. Current at higher volts means more watts, which means more work is being done, and less voltage sag equates to usually lower internal resistance and less heat buildup. So all in all, I think the longest burst is probably the single best indicator of a battery's overall performance out of all of the spreadsheet, if you had to pick one thing. You can't look at longest burst in a vacuum, though. You also have to take into consideration temperature. In my opinion, any battery that finishes the test at over 125 degrees Fahrenheit should be essentially rejected because it's going to destroy itself very quickly. A battery with that much heat buildup, number one, it will often have also a high internal resistance. But some of these batteries actually seem to deliver long bursts with little sag and still have a lot of heat buildup. I don't know why that is. Any battery that regularly goes over 125 degrees Fahrenheit is hurting itself. And some of these batteries are up in the 130s, and that's not good. That's not a battery that's going to last very long. Personally, I wouldn't buy it. You might say, well, I want a battery that's going to, burn bright and burn short. But you don't have to choose that. There are excellent performing batteries on the spreadsheet that deliver great performance without going into dangerous temperatures. So unless you just have a very limited selection of batteries in your area, I think you should just ignore any battery that finishes the 60 amp test over 125 degrees. Over about 120 degrees is still questionable. Below 120 degrees is great, and below 115 degrees is exceptional. The next metric that I want to call your attention to is the watt hours metric. The watt hours is the amount of total work that the battery did during the test. Basically, more watt hours means that you got more thrust, more speed. I want to say more power, but power is watts, and watt hours is something else. You got more oomph from the battery. The battery delivered more amps at higher volts, and that's basically the more watt hours the battery delivered, the better. A battery that delivered a lot of amps or a long burst, but with a low watt hours, means that it delivered a long burst but at a low voltage, and that's maybe not as good as a battery that delivered a shorter burst but still an okay burst with a higher voltage and gave more watt hours. So more watt hours is good. And then finally, and this is not a top tier metric, but one that's worth kind of thinking about a little bit, is the grams per watt hour, which is a measure of the battery's energy density. So a battery with lower grams per watt hour, lower is better, is going to be a lighter battery that still delivers the watt hours. So all else being equal, a battery with lower grams per watt hour would be better. Now, I've been doing these tests for a while. I've been collecting these numbers, and I've wanted to do for a while a sort of a meta-analysis of the numbers to get a perspective on where they come in and to answer some bigger questions. And I'm going to do that now. This chart shows the distribution of the longest bursts for all of the batteries that I've tested. And what we can see is that the vast majority of batteries that I tested had a longest burst between 4 and 8 seconds. Now that's a 60 amp burst. Now a 60 amp burst at 4 seconds is completely respectable. If you think about punching out to fly over some trees or coming around a turn on a race and jamming the throttle to get going the other direction, you might hit 60 or 70 or 80 amps. And if a battery can hold that for 3 seconds, that's still perhaps enough for what you're doing. But I think we'd all agree that the batteries that are holding 60 amps for longer are doing better. And what we see is that the vast majority come in under 8 seconds, and then a few of them come in, let's say, up to around 16 or 20 seconds, and then there are some real outliers up in the high numbers. And bear in mind, some of these are 1800s and some of these are 1300s, so this is not exactly apples to apples. I wasn't trying to do any really deep comparisons here, just get a sort of a general picture and a perspective on what's a good number here. And a good number is, well, you could certainly say any battery that beats 8 seconds is probably in the top 50% easily. I don't know how the numbers actually work out because I didn't do cumulative percentages. Oh well. The next thing I want to show you is the milliamp percent delivered at 20 amps. And what this is a percentage of the battery's rated capacity that it actually delivered before hitting 14 volts at 20 amps discharge rate. Basically, this is an assessment of how honest the manufacturer's rating on the label is. And by my standards, if a battery delivers at least 80% of its rated capacity before falling to 14 volts, that's for a 4S, of course, then that's an honest rating. And we can see that the vast majority of these batteries delivered at least 80% of their rated capacity, right? These two lines are the biggest, 82 through 91%. And in fact, many of them, 91 and 95%. It was only a very few batteries that didn't deliver at least 80% of their rated capacity. Takeaway message, most manufacturers are, if anything, underrating their batteries, perhaps, but few of them are overrating them. This chart shows a distribution of the grams per watt hour at a 60 amp discharge rate. Now, of course, the discharge rate is important because the battery will deliver fewer watts at a higher discharge rate because there will be more sag and you'll stop the test earlier. Also, at higher discharge rates, you're wasting more energy as heat and you're getting less mechanical energy and electrical energy out of the battery. But I've chose the 60 amp discharge rate because I think that's the most interesting one. The entire purpose of this chart is so that when you're looking at the batteries back on the spreadsheet and trying to say, is this battery particularly energy dense or is it particularly inefficient? Then this can give you a little bit of a perspective on that. Now again, lower is better when it comes to grams per watt hour. So these batteries down in the 10 to 11 grams per watt hour are exceptionally energy dense. Batteries around 13 to 14 grams per watt hour are more in the middle, and batteries around 16 to 17 grams per watt hour, let's say more than 14. First of all, there are very few of those, and those are exceptionally not energy dense. So there's a little bit of a perspective on that number. Now I have two more that I want to show you. I think two more. And these I think are really interesting. I did some correlations. One of the questions that I asked was, is there a correlation between the battery's performance and its C rating on paper? And the metric that I chose as a proxy for overall performance is the longest 60 amp burst. And if there was a correlation between the longest burst and the C rating on paper, then what we would see is that in general, as we got over to the right side of this graph, we would get higher and higher dots. So essentially, we would see a straight line going up. And we don't see that. We see in a little bit, maybe towards the middle here, that we got some higher numbers here. But overall, I just don't think there's a big correlation. There are many batteries with a very high C rating, 120 C rated battery, that did not have a long burst. And there are many batteries with a very reasonable C rating that had a super long burst. So, and this is I use the Excel correlation function. Basically, 1 is a strong correlation and 0 is no correlation. I think -1 is also a strong correlation the other way. But you can see that this is a very low number and there is almost no correlation between these two metrics. In other words, what you knew already, C rating on the label is nonsense. It's almost complete nonsense. Ignore it completely. The last thing I'm going to show you before I get to the actual results of this testing is there a correlation between a battery's price and its overall performance? And the answer, interestingly, is yes, at least a little bit. Look right here. Isn't this cool? Data is so cool. It's so cool when data shows you things. Look, we kind of do see a sloped line here. Now, there are many expensive batteries, like these batteries over here, expensive batteries that are not delivering fantastic performance, sub 10-second longest burst. But in general, you can see a trend that as you get to more expensive batteries, more of the batteries deliver longer bursts. And in fact, the correlation is 0.43, which is further from 0. It's not 1, but it's definitely not 0 either. So in fact, if you're looking for high performance, you generally will have to pay more, although there are some exceptions. All right, well, let's get into the actual results of this testing. And I'm going to do a little filter on my data. I'm going to filter and just look at group 4. And I'm also going to get rid of these 3S batteries because I actually recorded this entire voiceover once already, and I accidentally included the 3S batteries and forgot that they were 3S and said some irrelevant things. So here's the 3S batteries from mylipo.de. You can see the results. They're the best 3S batteries I've ever tested because they're the only 3S batteries I've ever tested, I think. Anyway, there they go. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, 3S. Okay, so now we're looking at the Group 4 4S batteries. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sort. And I'm going to sort based on my favorite metric, the longest burst time. I'm going to sort largest to smallest. So basically, if we looked at only that metric, the best battery would be on top. And the best battery in this testing by that single metric would be the Strix 1550 LiPo, submitted to me by Ready Made RC, although I don't know who else sells them. Maybe somebody else sells them, but mine came from Ready Made RC. The Strix 1550 LiPo had a 55-second burst. That's pretty darn respectable. We can see several other batteries in here that had very, very respectable bursts. Remember I said basically anything over, I think it was 12 seconds is impressive and certainly above average. We have many batteries in this test that did that. The Newbie Drone Nitro Nectar 13, the Newbie Drone Nitro Nectar 14, my LiPo DE 1600, the Revolectrix GoPack Silver, more about that in a minute, the famous Indestructible Quads Black Label. All of these batteries had exceptionally longest bursts. So then the next place I would go as I look at these batteries is, how hot were they at the end of the test? And we can see that the Revolectrix 435 GoPack Silver 1550 high volt was 125 degrees. And that's consistent with my experience of Revolectric batteries in previous testing. They get very, very hot, and I have a lot of anecdotal reports from the field that they don't last very long. And that's consistent with my experience with high volt batteries I had Mad Dogs from 2Dog RC. Mine had certainly no more than 30 cycles on them, and I'm not hugely abusive on my batteries, and they just were dead. They were saggy and dead and just unusable, and I concluded that high volts just don't last. I've heard too many anecdotal reports about that, and that's been the best conclusion I can come to based on the limited data that I have. Now, the Revolectrix GoPacks are interesting because they're graphene batteries, and so the hope that I would have would be that maybe somehow the graphene would cancel out some of the negative effects of the high volts and we get a great battery. But the fact that this battery finished the test at 125 degrees is not encouraging, and the fact that there are several better batteries that performed better at a lower temperature, says to me that this one I don't think this is worth considering. Now we've also got the Ombo 1500 LiPo at 124 degrees, just barely squeaking in under 125 at a price of $40. I think you can do better. The Ombo 1500 Graphene had a longer max burst and came in at only 120 degrees. So between the 1500 LiPo and the 1500 Graphene from Ombo, same price, I would take the Graphene. The Indestructible Quads Black Label 1500. That is a battery that has gotten a lot of press lately. Indestructible Quads released a test where they drew, I think it was 130 amps from the battery for 30 seconds. My testing did not reproduce that result exactly, and the reason for that is that I didn't do the same testing they did. They discharged to something like 13.5 volts. I stopped the test when the battery sagged to 14 volts, so I only got a 22-second longest burst. However, that's a very, very respectable number. This is an excellent performing battery, and at a price of only $20, it may be the value performer in this test. However, if we go to the watt hours column, we can see that the Indestructible Quads Black Label 1500 did deliver a notably smaller number of watt hours compared to the more expensive batteries. So the Ombo 1500, almost 15 watt hours, 14.4 watt hours, and 14.0 watt hours for the Strix. Again, the Ombo 1500 Graphene really excelling here. Not quite as much as the LiPo version, but at a good temperature. And so you have to ask yourself, is it worth paying twice the price to get just that little bit more oomph? Let's not underestimate the difference that a whole extra watt hour out of a battery makes. It's not insubstantial. If we look at the grams per watt hour, we can see that these top batteries are coming in around the mid-13s. And then suddenly we've got the newbie drone here, the Nitro Nectar 1500 at 15.6 grams per watt hour. Why is it so much worse in terms of its energy density? And of course, the reason is that it's got that aluminum case, and that's adding weight so that it hurts your grams per watt hour. I think the thing to say about this battery is that if you want a cased battery, this is a really solid performer. If you're buying a case battery, you know that you're paying a little bit of extra weight in exchange for that extra protection. That's just a trade-off you're willing to make. At a price of $30 and a longest burst of 14 seconds, that's completely respectable, just barely cracking the sort of middle-of-the-road threshold for the standout batteries versus the average ones. I think this one would be a solid buy. The 1300 newbie drone, which is also cased, has a slightly better grams per watt hour and slightly worse stats than the 1500, but it's also a little bit lighter. Normally, I don't think there's much of a difference between a 1300 and a 1500 on a copter. I'm not sure that I feel that extra few grams in flight so much, maybe a little. But if you're buying a case battery anyway, it might be better to pick the 1300, and that one's it's $1 cheaper if you care about that. There's one more battery in this testing that I have to call your attention to, and that is the MaxAmps 1800 LiPo. This battery, I didn't do 60 amp testing on this battery because it did so badly in the 20 amp testing, I knew it would just blow up. I tried the 60 amp testing, and the minute I closed the switch, it was at 13.99, and I literally didn't even get a half a second of pulse out of it. To make matters worse, at the end of the 20 amp testing, the freaking battery was at 135 degrees. Now that's only 20 amps. If it hits 135 degrees after 20 amp testing, I don't think it's safe to discharge at a continuous 60 amps. I think it will reach a temperature where it's in risk of going into thermal runaway, whatever. The fire comes out of the battery. Bad. Fire bad, right? So I didn't do the 60 amp testing on it. And when I found out that MaxAmps charges, no kidding, $70 freaking for this battery, I was absolutely blown away. Now, some of my commenters have told me that MaxAmps at least once threatened to take legal action against a reviewer who said bad things about their batteries. And in light of that, I would like to be very clear that I am only speaking about the specific battery that I got. I cannot vouch that it is a MaxAmps battery. I cannot vouch that it was not tampered with or abused. I can't say that about any of my batteries. And if anyone from MaxAmps or any vendors want to send me another MaxAmps battery to test, I'll be happy to do that. Anytime I can't vouch for these batteries, all I can do is say that they came in the mail and I tested them, and here are the results. And that's hopefully more information than you had before you watched that video, and hopefully most of the information is accurate. But this battery, this specific battery, was literally the worst battery I've ever tested. So if it is reflective of MaxAmps' general quality, then I have no idea what MaxAmps is doing, charging such a preposterous amount for such a bad battery. Personally, I'm most interested in the Ombo 1500 graphene. Many graphene batteries don't actually deliver peak amps very well, but they're very sort of consistent performers at sticking with it. They're slow and steady. Well, they're not slow, but you know what I mean. So for me, the Ombo 1500 graphene is what I'm very interested in, although at a price of $40, that's awfully hard to swallow. I think the value performer here is definitely the Indestructible Quads Black Label. The fact that it finished the test at a reasonable temperature gives me hope for its longevity. I also have to say that the Infinity 1500 graphene from Banggood in my last round of testing did a very, very good job. I have some of those coming in the mail to test because I've heard some people say they bought them on my recommendation and they didn't find that they performed very well. And again, you watch the testing, you buy the battery, you buy another battery 3 months later. How do you know if it's the same one? Things change very fast in this field, and also there's always the possibility that there's variance in the manufacturing. As I said on the live stream, if I was to really do this perfectly, I would buy all the batteries off retail. I would not let manufacturers send them to me for the risk of cherry picking. I would buy them off retail. I would buy 5 or 10 of every battery. I would buy a battery in January and a battery in February. I would keep retesting them. I would buy one battery from California and one from Florida, and that's just a level of rigor that I'm not capable of going to. All I can do is test the batteries I get and tell you what the results are, and hope that that's more information than you had before you watched the video. So I am looking forward to retesting some of those Infinity graphenes when they come in the mail. I also have some of the Infinity 1300 race spec ones, also graphenes, and we're going to see how they do. I think those, if they test as well in my retest as they did in the original testing, I think they may be my current preference, because it's a graphene that's a really solid performer for only $20 compared to the Ombo graphene, which is a solid performer for $40. All right, well, there's all the results. You can go play with this spreadsheet yourself. If that's what you'd like to do, you can download it. There's a link in the video description. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy flying.